Hey, good morning, church. This morning we're going to continue in our Christmas series, and as we're doing so, I would ask you to turn to the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to find our text this morning in chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. As you're turning there, when we think of Christmas, oftentimes we think of gifts. And we even did a small gift exchange yesterday at our Christmas fellowship party right next door. It was a wonderful time. We're going to find even in our text this morning, we're going to see the giving of the original gifts at the very first Christmas with the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh. But as we go through this story, I want you to note that before the first Christmas gifts were ever given to Jesus, a greater gift was offered to him, the gift of worship. The one thing that God does not have, and the only thing that we can give to him, is our worship. There's nothing that God needs from us, but there is one thing that he desires from us this Christmas, and that is our worship of Jesus. So this morning, we're going to look at a very familiar Christmas story about the Magi, or the wise men. And we're going to seek to renew in our heart a deep desire to worship Jesus as the chief focus of our Christmas this year. And so let us turn in our Bibles to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, as we consider a Christmas message that I've titled, The Magi, and a lesson about worship. So follow along in your Bibles as I read. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him. And when Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And gathering together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he was inquiring of them where the Christ was to be born. And they said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for this is what has been written by the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judea, are by no means least among the leaders of Judah, for out of you shall come forth a leader who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and carefully determined from them the time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, and he said, Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me, so that I too may come and worship him. Now after hearing the king, they went their way, and behold, the star, which they had seen in the east, was going on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother, and they fell on the ground and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi departed for their own country by another way. Boy, as this story unfolds this morning, there is a theme that emerges from its different parts. We see in verse 2, for example, that the Magi appeared, and it says they have come to worship Jesus. And in verse 8, Herod appears with an offer to come and worship Jesus. And finally, our story concludes right here in verse 12 with the Magi falling on the ground and worshiping Jesus. The focus then of our story revolves around the act of worship. And so we're going to learn from the story some important truths concerning our response of worship to Christ at Christmas. And the first thing we discover from our text is found in point number 1. God draws us to worship Jesus at Christmas. The story opens in verse 1 through 7 with, Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east and have come to worship him." And when Herod heard this, he was troubled, and all of Jerusalem with him. And gathering all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he was inquiring of them, "Where is the Christ to be born?" They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for that this is what has been written by the prophets. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judea, by no means least among the leaders of Judah. For out of you shall come forth a leader who will shepherd my people, Israel." So as this story opens, we're introduced to two characters. You have the Magi and you have Herod the king. And the main thrust of our plot this morning is going to follow along with the Magi. However, there's another plot in play here, one that revolves around King Herod, and that's going to continue beyond our text this morning. So first, let's take a look at the Magi. Who are these men? Well, sometimes you'll find them called Magi or wise men or even kings, depending on your translation or tradition. And the best we can understand of who these men were is what we find back in the Old Testament concerning a similar group of men identified in Daniel chapter 2. We see this in the text in Daniel 2:2. "Then the king said to call the magicians, the conjurers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king." So in Daniel 2, that word there for Chaldeans in the Hebrew, when it translates to Greek, is Magi. These would have been a class of wise men specializing in astrology and astronomy. And our text this morning says that they were from the east. So that means likely the Persia region. So then the question emerges, what do these men have to do with Jesus, the King of the Jews, or Israel in general? And quite frankly, they don't have much to do with any of that. And it's a bit strange that it was these men who saw the sign given by God and were drawn by God in such a way to understand that something big was happening in the land of Judah, that a king had been born worthy of worship. In the end, God, He has sent this spectacular sign in the heavenlies, seen from far away, and by many, it was recognized by this group of men as a sure sign of the Messiah. King of the Jews had been born. And what's amazing, absolutely amazing in this story is that the first group of religious people to rightly discern what was going on in the land, that the Messiah had come, this was from a group of mystical and occultic traditions from out of pagan lands, and yet they came from afar to worship the Lord because God drew them to Jesus. And so it is, these men show up. They come to the city of David, the center of Jewish worship, and ask, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." And this is the question that the Magi send the entire city into a panic because the nation was clueless. They were caught flat-footed. They missed the biggest event in their prophetic timeline. They missed the biggest event in world history, that the Christ had been born. And not only born, he was just 10 miles away from Jerusalem in the city of Bethlehem. And so we see as this very first Christmas scene unfolds for us on the pages of Scripture, we learn something absolutely fundamental about the birth of Jesus, that it commands our worship of him. So when this reality set in the land of Judea, the very first thing the Magi sought, we see, was to worship the King, to go and worship Jesus. This is what God has intended as humanity's response to the news of Jesus' birth at Christmas. God drew the Magi to Christ to worship him. We see the sign of God drew them to the city of God, where they receive a word from God concerning Christ. We have come to worship him. You know, a Christmas without the worship of Jesus, it's like going to the store for eggs. Then after we get there, we pack our cart full of everything else that we've realized we need, and then we get home and we realize, uh-oh, I forgot the eggs. The very reason why I went to the store in the first place. And when I look at our culture today, you know what? We have packed our cart full of all sorts of things at Christmas. So much so that it's overflowing. But sadly, when it's all said and done and the holiday is over, many in our culture will have forgotten the eggs. They will have missed the primary reason for why God has set aside as a special day this day to worship Jesus. And notice that through the presence of the Magi, that Christmas is not a Christian holiday and only Christians ought to worship Christ at Christmas. No, God drew the Magi. And God is drawing every person everywhere to come and worship Jesus on this day that has been set apart for his birth. Because God draws us to worship Jesus at Christmas. But not only is this our reality today, but we see something else in our text. In point number 2, the world will offer false worship to Jesus at Christmas. The story continues in verse 7 through 8. Then Herod secretly called the Magi and carefully determined from them the time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. And when you have found him, report to me so that I too may come and worship him." Well, I told you earlier, our story starts with 2 characters and 2 plots. Well, now we're quickly going to turn our attention to King Herod. You know, you're going to encounter several Herods in the New Testament. But this is the first. This is Herod the Great. And we have a pretty good picture of who this guy is based on ancient histories that were written about him during his life or shortly after his life. And what we've seen is that Herod proved his value in the emerging Roman Empire of his day by being a skilled warrior and military leader. His greatest skill in life was fighting and winning. His reputation and results on the battle and loyalty to the emperor in Rome made him a rare choice to establish as a king inside of the Roman Empire. For the emperor to make Herod a king means the emperor had the highest degree of confidence that Herod would do what was in the best interest of Rome. That is, of course, after Herod satisfied his own self-interests. One historian characterizes Herod this way: wherever his own interests seemed to demand it, he carried matters through with an iron hand and was quick to shed streams of blood that he might reach his objective. Another ancient historian describes Herod this way: all his devices and endeavors, all his plans of action were aimed directly towards one end: to extend his power, his dominion, his glory. This is the Herod we meet in our story this morning. In short, he's not a good guy. And so when you see Herod come to the Magi in secret and commission them to go search and report back, there is more going on here than what he says, so that I may come and worship him too. Make no mistake, Herod was not interested in another king coming into his land and having authority over his people. So when we see Herod say, so I can come and worship him too, Herod will say whatever it takes. And we'll see later in the chapter, he's going to do whatever it takes to prevent Jesus from changing his life one bit. This man with a rebellious heart, he's unwilling to bow to a sovereign God and king, unwilling to relinquish the rule and authority over his life to anyone. His pride, selfish ambition, and love of sin will cause him to go to the extremes to keep his life just as it is. And you know what? That means even if he has to offer up false worship to Jesus to get exactly what he wanted. You know, this behavior from Herod, it's not unique to him. Our world is full of people that will say whatever it takes, that will do whatever it takes to advance their own selfish end, even under the guise of false worship and religion at Christmas. Herod's motivations for false worship, as we're going to see later in the chapter, it was to kill Jesus. Herod was the first to seek a Christless Christmas through an offer of worship. As crazy as that sounds, where Herod eventually failed, others have succeeded. And if you look at the world today, all across our community, when you go back to school, when you go back to work after Christmas, and you engage with people in your offices or in your life, and you ask them, they say, we celebrated Christmas. You're going to find many of them celebrated a Christless Christmas. Because you'll say, how did you celebrate Christmas? And what you're going to hear is, we had a tree, we had lights, we did a gift exchange, we even had a nice meal. Hey, and we're going to do all those things at my house, don't get me wrong, but when you ask them, how did you worship Jesus on Christmas, you're going to hear, we don't do that. And so the sad reality is that every year at Christmas, our world gets filled with false worship of Jesus for no other purpose than to benefit a personal pursuit of self-interest. There are some, like Herod, will offer false worship for the purpose of destroying Christ's cause in the world. Others will simply see an opportunity to profit. And I'm telling you, for the sinner, the birth of Jesus represents the biggest threat they will ever face in their lives. Because if the king has come, that means he has authority, power, and purpose over the lives of all of humanity. And the sinner refuses to cede any authority to anyone other than themselves. Herod said the right words, but in his heart planned to do the exact opposite. False worship can sound great. It can even look great. But when the worship is offered with illegitimate motives and followed by corrupt actions, then that is not worship that Jesus receives to himself. And so, now for us, for those who love Jesus, who rejoice in his coming, we learn something important about what we offer to him as worship at Christmas in our third and final point, point number 3. The greatest gift we can give Jesus is our worship at Christmas. Our story concludes in verse 9 through 11. Now after hearing the king, they went away, and behold, the star which they had seen in the east was going on before them until it came and stood over the place where the child was. And when they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And after coming into the house, they saw the child with Mary, his mother. And they fell on the ground and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they presented him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Boy, this is both the climax and the resolution of our plot line in the story concerning the Magi. What started as a quest, a search for a king, They find the one they've been looking for, and they worshiped him. They saw the star and rejoiced. They saw the child and worshiped. Even though the Magi carried with them these precious gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh, these are fabulous gifts worth lots of money. The very first thing they offered, it was none of those gifts, but it was worship. This is the greatest gift that anyone can offer to Jesus at Christmas, our worship. When you think about Jesus, he's God. What could we possibly get God as a gift that he doesn't already have? I mean, he's all powerful. He's over all things. All things belong to him. Yet there's one thing that God will never possess unless we give it to him. That's our worship. This is what he desires from each and every one of us. Look, it's not a bad thing that we associate gift giving with Christmas. I mean, we have right here our model for doing this, and we spend a lot of time trying to figure out the perfect gift for others in our lives. And that can be hard. I mean, I'll tell you what, I am a horrible person to gift shop for. Because to tell you the truth, if I want something, I'll usually go out and get it for myself if I can. And if you ask Susie, I've bought myself enough Christmas gifts to last me a lifetime. But I will say, in all our generosity and love for others, we can miss our perfect gift for the perfect gift giver, our act of worship to Jesus. Now, I submit that the giving of the gifts by the Magi here, the gold, the frankincense, the myrrh, that wasn't a separate thing. I would say that these served to amplify their worship. They gave these precious gifts willingly, generously, personally, and directly. This was the best of what they had to offer to Jesus. We should think about our worship of him in the same way. It should come from us willingly, generously, personally, and directly. We should offer Jesus the best of what we have to offer. Our praise, adoration, thanksgiving, our complete surrender to his will, our wholehearted devotion, and our absolute exaltation of him over our lives. That's what our worship looks like at Christmas. It's rooted in our disposition towards him, and it comes as a response of who he is and what he's done in our lives. Look, I'm telling you, we all have reason to worship, and we have a season to worship, not just Christmas, but every day of our lives. So in closing, Christmas is absolutely a time of worship. And I really enjoy a lot of things at this time of year. But we are drawn by God to Christ to worship him at Christmas, and the greatest gift we have to offer is our worship to him at Christmas. This is foundational when it comes to the birth of Jesus. And we can learn through the Magi's example that our worship, it comes as the first priority. We offer it freely. We offer it generously from the best that we have in ourselves. This year is our opportunity to renew in our heart an attitude of worship to Jesus at Christmas. Now, as we look forward to next week, our story with the Magi, it ends here. But you see in verse 12, and having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, the Magi departed for their own country by another way. The Magi depart, but Herod remains. And he has big plans. Our story continues next week with a fallout over the first Christmas. And the rage of the world is thrashing out against the reality that Jesus has been born, and it will be through the continued faith of Joseph that Jesus foils the plans of the wicked. Let's pray.